Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming. I'm Simon Crowther, a 2007 flood victim, and in 2012 founded Flood Protection Solutions, and also got a degree in civil engineering. So thank you for coming. We're all interested in flooding or flood prevention. In 2007, we saw an unprecedented amount of rainfall between May and June, the wettest period on record since records began in 1766. The resulting floods were devastating, with loss of life, 55,000 homes affected, and nearly 7,000 businesses flooded. 17,000 families had to leave their homes, and unfortunately 13 people died. The floods were far-reaching, with it occurring in Scotland, East Yorkshire, the Midlands, Gloucestershire, Herefordshire, Oxfordshire, Berkshire, and South Wales. Following the 2 months of almost non-stop rain, flooding became inevitable when a month's worth of rain then fell in 24 hours. An Environment Agency report published in 2010 estimated the total economic cost of the flooding to be around £3.2 billion. The effects were devastating, and in the aftermath, streets were lined with skips and caravans whilst residents tried to live normal lives. They also became project managers for the repair work to their homes and had to deal with very complex insurance claims. My interest in flooding also started back in 2007, when our family home was flooded and we were out of the house in rented accommodation for nearly a year whilst it was repaired. I remember waking up one morning, it was the 20th of June in 2007, and looking out the window to see the garden was full of water. We went downstairs for breakfast as if everything was normal. Water hadn't yet entered the home at this point, but we discovered the fridge wasn't working, and we soon realised we hadn't any electricity. My father at this point opened the internal garage access door, which was off the kitchen, to reset the electricity. It was dark, and without power, he cried out as he suddenly put his bare foot into a couple of inches of slimy mud, which was then when we realised the garage, which was at a slightly lower level than the kitchen floor, had flooded. And my parents took the day off work to clear everything up and disinfect. And we thought nothing more of it, didn't think it was going to happen again. A neighbour said to us, "Oh, the road was like a fast-flowing river last night." And we thought, yeah, sure it was, unable to believe it. And we still thought that the rainwater had fallen just straight out of the sky and stayed in the garden and wasn't from the stream that ran through the village, because the stream at most of the times is pretty much empty, bit of a trickle. In the summer it can dry up. The council came round afterwards and offered every alternative house 6 sandbags. Apparently there weren't enough to go round every home. Not sure what 6 sandbags was going to do, but we thought we were lucky because we got the designated 6 sandbags. All I've told you about so far was the calm before the storm. 2 days later, the house flooded to a depth of about a foot. In 2007, flooding was far less well understood. The dangers weren't as well known, and 2007 was definitely a wake-up call. It wasn't until a couple of days later, water had started to fill the road and edge towards the house, that at the time my mother started to become a little bit anxious. She never envisaged the amount of water that would enter the house. As the water started getting deeper, she thought that putting a few towels down across the bottom of the doors would stop the flood, but oh how wrong she was. Even though this was a new house with concrete floors, we noticed that water was coming in through the walls where the arrow is, and where the walls met the floor, which became key to our future flood defence method. The village is in a 3-sided valley, and the flooding was certainly a flash flood. The water left as soon as it arrived, and after about 2 hours, the water had subsided, but the devastation was complete. The insurance company came and brought dehumidifiers and fans, but we still had no idea of the scale of the damage that flooding causes, and neither did any of our neighbours. We honestly thought that the insurance company would come, just wet back the carpet, see what damage had happened to the wood floor, maybe change that, and then we'd carry on as normal. How wrong we were. There was an insurance claim for £120,000 and we were out of the house for 9 months. 3 days later, the flood came again. There was actually 5 floods over a period of about a month. This time I was at home and I created sandbag defences with the 6 sandbags we'd got. It was just then when I realised how ineffective sandbags were. I'd positioned them really well, so I thought, but the water went straight through and flooded the house yet again. And I've managed to find some footage of this. We were on TV on both BBC, ITV Central and ITV National News, and I knew I'd got it somewhere on a VHS tape, but watching 20 VHS tapes, because none of them were labelled, to try and find the footage wasn't fun. But I've had it converted to digital. I still can't believe 10 years ago we were using VHSs, but here's the footage.
Flood warnings as torrential rains hit the East Midlands.
Almost a month's worth of rain has fallen in parts of the region in just 24 hours.
There have been floods before, but people who've lived here all their lives say they've never seen it coming down here.
That's the top story in the East Midlands this Monday evening. With no sign of the rainfall easing, the Met Office is warning there's more to come. The Environment Agency says hundreds of homes across the East Midlands are still at risk of flooding. They say people should be ready to take precautions, sandbag their homes and switch off the gas and electricity.
This little stretch of water, described by locals as a trickle into the Trent, became a raging torrent last night following that torrential rain. People woke up to 3 foot deep of water racing through here down to Loudham, Woodborough and beyond. For residents it was chaos at times. The effects of the floodwaters were devastating.
The waters just kept on coming. This is what people were waking up to this morning at Lamley in Nottinghamshire and other villages nearby. For Paul and Kate Crowther and their family in Woodborough, the whole of the ground floor of their house was calf deep in floodwater.
It's the 3rd time this week we've been flooded. This is the worst one so far. It's sort of been about a couple of inches higher than the skirting boards this time. But all the residents who've lived here all their lives say that they've never known it this bad before.
The stream that runs through Lamley overflowed as the torrential rain set in. For the residents here, it was a question of hoping and praying it wouldn't come into their homes.
So after 5 floods in a month, we never wanted to go through the upheaval expense or stress again, and thought there was no point having the insurance company spend all of this money to put everything back. The plaster came off up to the ceilings, all the furniture was changed. And it's small things that we didn't know at the time, but furniture we'd saved, by the time they'd brought in dehumidifiers, wooden cabinets had ended up cracking, leather sofas had been ruined, all by the drying process, which I think is a big change that we've since learned. There hadn't been such a big flood for this knowledge to be even known or shared. But as I mentioned, we noticed that water didn't just enter through the doors, but also through the house walls and up through where the floor damp-proof course met the walls. So we wanted to keep the water away from the property so that we could try and keep it out. And we realised that if we wanted to stop the property flooding, we'd have to take action ourselves. We couldn't rely on other people. So we had walls built around the garden perimeter, which just left the driveway gap. And back in 2007, the flood defence market was a lot smaller, and in the UK we were getting quotes for the driveway for the house of about £24,000, which 10 years ago as well. It was then we came across a Canadian product called the Watergate barrier for around 1/10 of the price, and we ordered it hoping we'd never need it. But you never know with flooding, and if it's happened once, it's likely to happen again. again. It was supposedly a one-off, but there we were 5 years later. The road became like a brown, fast-flowing river, and we rolled out the barrier and hoped it would work just as the company's video had shown. This time we were prepared. The barrier saved the house. You can see that the lawn's still dry. There's a bit of a puddle because it was left on a gravel driveway, so we had a small puddle pump that dealt with that. And I think there were 2 floods in June 2012, then 3 more in the November, and every single time the Watergate saved the house. Neighbours and the Environment Agency were so impressed, they asked where the barrier came from and if they could get one. I was really keen to help others across the UK to reduce their flood risk, and so Flood Protection Solutions was born in 2012 to become the UK's supplier of the Watergate barrier. Since then, we've grown into one of the UK's leading flood defence companies, primarily for temporary flood defences with the Watergate. But the 2007 floods proved a big game changer, as so much has altered since then. Sir Michael Pitt's review of the 2007 floods provided 92 recommendations about flood predictions, prevention and emergency management, and this report led to a Flood and Water Management Act, improved flooding oversight, and also led to a new era in technological advances. One of the major changes was to have the Environment Agency and Met Office working in partnership to create the National Flood Forecasting Centre. This collaborative approach combined experts who predict the weather along with those who knew to respond. And I was just sat on a panel on the other side of the room, and they were saying they're literally next to each other. Their chairs are all on wheels so they can quickly nip over and have a chat about how to respond. John Curtin, the Executive Director of Flood and Coastal Management at the Environment Agency, recently explained that the Environment Agency had focused heavily on improving the chain as an overall response to flooding. This included detecting an emerging flood, forecasting where and when it will occur, warning communities and partners, and responding to the risk. There have clearly been improvements in all areas of the chain. There's now a river level monitoring service. We've got the Flood Forecasting Centre, along with a new flood warning system. So in these 2012 floods, we were getting texts to our phone saying there's likely to be a flood. The flood warning system can alert 1.2 million people at the touch of a button, and you can sign up for this free service on the Environment Agency's website. In December 2013, the Environment Agency also used Twitter to alert of a severe flood. To respond to flooding, there's been investment in new kit with 40 kilometres of temporary flood barriers, 250 high-volume pumps and 4 response vehicles. And in amongst this kit is some Watergate barriers, albeit not as much as I'd like. As well as changes in the Environment Agency, there have been changes in fire and rescue services. The tragic death of Michael Barnett, who was trapped in a flood drain in Hull, was another game changer. The fire and rescue services now have dry suits and life jackets on every engine, as well as access to rescue boats and flood rafts. The equipment levels have changed massively, and firefighters are now trained to perform rescues in moving water. Essex, along with Shropshire Fire and Rescue Service, also now have water gates as part of their flood control kits. One of the big changes has been a focus on giving the community control. Oh, I missed this slide. It was a photo with the Environment Agency with our barriers. There's been a big change on giving the community control. After all, they have the local knowledge of how the flooding happened and how the land's changed over years. So after talking to older residents in the village, we found out that the village had flooded before, but never to the extent, because it's a 3-sided valley, and the farmers used to contour plough because their machinery didn't have the power to go up and down the hills, whereas now they can plough straight up and down. It's easier for them, but the water runs straight off into the village. The level of awareness and communication are 2 huge differences between now and 2007. More people are aware of flooding now, as more people have been affected, both directly and indirectly, and more people use social media for emergencies and to connect with their local communities. Back Back in 2007, Twitter had only just been founded and wasn't widely used, and Facebook was only just becoming used by the younger generations, neither of which were popular. In 2007, Facebook had 50 million users, which is 37 times less than today's figure at around 1.86 billion. So we can see here that's not completely up to date, but it was the most recent I could find. Social media simply did not have the mass power it had today. And back in 2007, the whole community pulled together. I've heard people say that flooding can almost be a good time, a bit like a war effort. We met new neighbours, got invited into strangers' houses, people clubbed together. The real hardship is when the waters actually subside, the camera crews leave, and you're forgotten about. The cleanup begins. This is where we saw social media proving so powerful in the 2014 floods. Facebook groups were formulated with people offering help, cleaning products, sofas, and accommodation to those affected. Alongside the community effort is the way social media can inform and update people of floods. The hashtag functionality allows a conversation to be started and people can help each other along with themselves. There's also solidarity. We were just talking about this on the panel as well, and it's not just between flooding on social media. You could find earthquake victims now finding solidarity with people who've been affected by flooding. When I look back at our Twitter analytics from the 2014 floods, the reach was far greater than normal. We offered equipment on loan for free, along with expert advice out to people, ultimately helping them to reduce their danger and mitigate against damage. The 2007 floods were a huge learning experience for many, and this education has been a key change. There's been a strong push for new housing developments to use permeable paving and incorporate sustainable urban drainage schemes. 2007 was a game changer for this. Many of the floods were considered to be caused by surface water flooding. So permeable paving is designed to allow water to seep into the ground and therefore reduce the overloading of drains that's all too common. One item which is likely to help with mapping of floods and therefore protect assets are drones or UAVs. And I really had an interesting visit to one of our customers where they'd done everything they could. They knew they'd got a flood warning, they'd moved everything upstairs, and they'd flown their drone out over as the flooding started so they could map exactly where the water had come from and see as it surrounded the property, which was fascinating. But they're likely to also allow dams and existing flood defences to be inspected more easily where accessibility is poor. It's also likely that with technological advances in modelling and GPS that the accuracy of predictions will continue to improve over the coming years. But as good as technology is, sometimes we have to work with nature. And this has been another big lesson that we've learned since 2007. We can't just build concrete walls higher and higher. Flooding needs to be addressed through a range of solutions, but working with nature rather than against it is key to a more flood-resilient future. So the community I lived in, I showed you the clip from, everyone worked together. We all know where each other's flood defences are. We've got keys to each other's garages. There's waterproof instructions hanging up if someone's on holiday. And also, throughout the village, there's drain markers now which have been installed. So as you drive along the road, above the watermark, it's D1, D2, D3, so you can see where all of the drains are. So everyone is working in partnership, and we've actually managed to stop a few floods where the water overflows from the stream and can't get back into the culvert because there were leaves blocking the drains, and because we knew where the drains were as part of the community effort, we were able to move them and actually control the flood. So we need a range of solutions and work with nature for a more flood-resilient future. So to recap, the 2007 floods were a catalyst for working in partnership. It drove changes in policy, and the lessons learned were huge by many. Outside of flooding, the technological advances such as social media have been fantastic to help with the resilience. So how prepared are we for the next floods? Well, the main point we need to make here is when or where and not if. We can predict river flooding and where the floodplains are. We can map that. The problem I see is in the future is localised storms where flash flooding occurs in areas which may not have been affected before. Climate change means we need to constantly improve to keep abreast. At the minute, 1 in 6 homes is at risk of flooding. And it's pleasing to see innovation and partnership, but I still feel that innovation is heavily stifled by DEFRA and the Environment Agency. If you invent or design a new flood defence system, it appears they won't actually talk to you until it's kite marked or FM approved, which can cost in the region of £30,000 upwards. It could be a revolutionary system, but it's a lot of money to invest without interest and discussion first. If we look back over the past 10 years, all different areas of the country have been affected. We need to work with communities, nature and technology, whilst appreciating that flooding can't be prevented and we need to work to reduce the risk. As working with communities is so important, we've recently launched community flood kits, which include a range of products from foil blankets, alcohol gel, torches to flood barriers, pumps. We believe every single community that's at risk of flooding should have these available in a local resilience store, garage or even shed, allowing residents to better protect themselves. Over the past 10 years, we've seen there's been issues with funding, and we still seem to have a lot of those issues. These kits are great and are tailored to different community sizes, but we still have the issue of who is going to pay for them. Whenever grant funding is available, we will always try and work with the community, but unfortunately this is few and far between. There was recently an SSE grant designed to help communities in the south, but it was a postcode lottery. It was only really 2 counties covered, and there were other communities that are at risk without funding. And on another note, I'm always disappointed by the reactive reporting to flooding rather than proactive. When flooding doesn't occur, I mean, we are getting better at this, but when flooding doesn't occur, it tends not to be in the news, and therefore the education and awareness tails off. And I think education and awareness are so key to driving change. There's been so much education and awareness since 2007, but we can't let it stop if there's not a flood for a few years. Flooding is the biggest threat to the UK as a result of climate change, and we need to make sure it stays at the top of decision makers' mindsets. I want to change this, so I'm actually launching a YouTube series where I'll visit various towns across the UK and speak to residents who've been flooded, discussing the impact of flooding on their lives, looking at the historical data they might have with photos, depth markers. And it's not often you actually hear from residents who have been affected. We might hear from a spokesperson on Sky News or the Environment Agency on the BBC. I want to make it that we're hearing from the people who've been flooded, how long it's taken them to get back to normal, if they've done anything to protect themselves. So we've got quite a few people lined up at the minute all across the UK, and we're still looking for more people who've been flooded and are happy to be interviewed, all to help awareness and help the cause. So if you're happy to be involved, please let me know and get in touch. And thank you for listening.